Get started. I'm Jeni Sorensen. I'm the director of the Human Trafficking Research Initiative at Innovations for Poverty Action, or IPA, and wanted to start by thanking ILO, IOM, and especially Lorenzo, Lorraine, and Kelly. I'm sure you've seen them a bunch over the last couple of days. They've spent countless hours getting this together, so we're really grateful to have had the opportunity to plan this with you and to co-host this, this conference. If you want to go to the next slide. There we go. So the HTRI team, we're quite small but powerful. I direct the initiative along with Sarah Consoli, who's my partner in crime. And then we have Guy Grossman and Cecilia Moe, who are our co-scientific advisors. So they're not staff at IPA, but they have an important role in steering the work of HTRI, and they act as standing members of our competitive fund selection committee. So some of you may be aware about our competitive fund. I'll talk about that more in a second. Go to the next slide. Okay. So IPA is primarily known for this Nobel recognized approach, which is building the evidence around causal impacts, primarily of poverty alleviation programs. So IPA works to create stronger evidence by initiating and leading research studies. Specifically, we do a lot of randomized control trials and impact evaluations, and we use other rigorous methodologies to let us isolate the effects of a program from other factors. And then we work to share the evidence strategically and equip decision makers to use the evidence. So we link the global evidence with the understanding of local issues. We have 22 country offices. We work with policymakers to gather data and analyze it, and then to conduct some of the research themselves. We have some programs like embedded labs where we provide support to government partners to do the research and to improve their M&E. And what's really relevant to what Kathy's been talking about is our right fit evidence unit, where we are working on kind of the path that Kathy was talking about, from ideation to testing and piloting to actually implementation. So IPA is known for its work kind of at the end of the scale, which is the impact evaluations, but we do actually assist implementing organizations, researchers, and policymakers across the research and implementation process. Okay, and the Human Trafficking Research Initiative was initiated in 2020. This is an example of actually donors funding research. The Department of State's Office to Combat and Monitor Trafficking in Persons, specifically the Program to End Modern Slavery, recognized that there has been decades of work and initiatives, interventions to combat human trafficking, but we still really had a lack of evidence around what works to reduce human trafficking. So this initiative specifically looks at rigorous interventions and research to influence the design and implementation of future interventions. And that is primarily done through impact evaluations or randomized control trials. And as part of this initiative, the major thing that we're doing is to steer research and to fund research. So we have a competitive research fund where we do partial and full funding for rigorous research, again, primarily randomized control trials. And we also do provide seed funding for that early stage work that needs to be done. So if there are data sets that can be analyzed, if there are travel grants that need to help a team come up with a strong research plan and idea, if there's a pilot, if there's programs that have been going on for maybe decades in the field and they're ready to evaluate it, but they need, again, some of that early stage testing, then we can fund that as well. To organize us through this initiative and through the way that we're thinking about the evidence and what are the gaps, we developed a research and learning agenda. So that's available on the web, and I'm sure we'll be sharing this presentation and these slides, and I'll put some of the links in the chat in a minute. But the context for this is that we spoke with over 100 donor organizations, researchers, policymakers, local and international NGOs, and academics and UN agencies like IOM and ILO to assess the gap in evidence and the research priorities. And then we did a desk review, and drew on my experience. I actually come from the counter-trafficking implementation world, so used some of that and my colleagues' knowledge to develop this. So we don't have time to go over everything, but you can see an overview of the contents of the RLA on your screen. And we came up with 5 priority research questions. So these are emerging themes and trends in the field. They highlight the gaps and then provide suggestions for future research questions. And they are organized around the 4P framework, which If you were on the call yesterday, Abby talked about the 4 Ps, prevention, protection, prosecution, and partnership. So my colleague Sarah is going to go over the learning questions and an overview of the existing evidence in the next few slides.
Hi, thank you so much, Jenny. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. So we categorized, as Jenny said, the learning questions around the 4 Ps. We'll go over some of the evidence, the rigorous evidence that exists to date at very high level. You can definitely look at the research and learning agenda and at these studies for more information. But just to start, our first learning question looks at how counter-trafficking actors can disrupt behaviors and social norms that normalize or promote human trafficking. There have been a couple of RCTs that kind of started out focusing on the impact of awareness campaigns and have found mixed impacts on actually reducing trafficking incidents, but more promising impacts on increasing knowledge. One in Nepal, a community awareness campaign, found increased knowledge, ability to identify, urgency and concern around the issue, but not an increase in awareness of the prevalence locally and that it happened right in their own community. And then one in Hong Kong focused on both the community and employers, found that it increased knowledge of forced labor, migrant domestic worker rights, but not necessarily on impacts on attitudes and practices. There's also a need for evidence surrounding discrete prevention approaches and packages of support for migrants specifically. A recent RCT in the Philippines examined the effects of pre-departure orientation seminars and found no effect actually on employment, settlement, and subjective well-being. There was an RCT by IOM that found, looked at peer-to-peer awareness campaigns for migrants in Senegal and found that it increased awareness of risks and opportunities and also reduced intention to migrate irregularly. Similarly, we are funding an ongoing study in Nigeria looking at whether information campaigns about risks, including specific information on trafficking along the Mediterranean route, affects likelihood of irregular migration attempts. Two other upcoming prevention RCTs funded by HTRI. There's the first is looking at a promising prevention education program in government schools in Brazil. They'll be evaluating a new rollout in a new municipality and a project in Greece examining the impact of information counseling via messaging apps for refugees and asylum seekers. Lastly, in prevention, there's a large gap in the evidence surrounding the direct links and abilities of traditional poverty alleviation and humanitarian programs to protect individuals from being trafficked. There was an impact evaluation in India looking at a community empowerment model where groups set their own key priorities for the intervention and found that it reduced indebtedness, improved food security, and resulted in an increased use of government services. And then one impact evaluation of an ILO fair recruitment program it was a pilot for migrants moving through the Nepal-Jordan corridor found improvements in well-being and productivity. So the most evidence on prevention, but definitely lots of work still to be done. Next, for protection, the research question looks at how counter-trafficking actors can most effectively support trafficking victims and improve outcomes for trafficking survivors. There's a gap in evidence surrounding the best practices for using frontline workers to identify victims of trafficking. There was an evaluation in California looking at presentations to emergency department workers and found that an increased recognition of victims and knowledge of resources such as who to call if they identify a potential victim. There's also an interest in approaches to support trauma and survivor-informed reintegration and facilitating entry into job markets. There's actually robust evidence on trafficking adjacent programs such as microcredit, cash transfers, holistic graduation approaches, vocational training, other interventions, work that IPA has done to look at a lot of this work and lots of other researchers. And so that evidence base exists, but often counter-trafficking agencies develop programs for survivors without knowing or building off of this evidence base, and HTRI hopes to bridge that gap a little bit. Next, on prosecution, the learning question looks at how governments can improve judicial effectiveness, combat corruption, and disrupt criminal networks and systems that allow trafficking to continue. There was a RCT in Nepal of police trainings and found that it was easier to increase knowledge on penalties rather than procedural knowledge, such as how to actually handle suspects and recognize trafficking. But the trainings did lead to a greater appreciation of male victimhood and the risk of trafficking occurring locally. So the last P, the questions, there's two that we've identified here. First, looking at how the private sector can strengthen actions and accountability to eliminate trafficking in global supply chains, and then how counter-trafficking actors can leverage technological advancements to combat trafficking. Lots of gaps in how what the role of technology can be in improving identification and investigation of trafficking cases. HTRI is actually funding a pilot to assess the feasibility of conducting an RCT of Facebook pages that promote safe migration and provide support and access to redress for migrant workers in the Philippines-Hong Kong migration corridor. They'll be presenting tomorrow, so you can hear from the Migration team there. There's also large gaps in evidence on measures to reduce exploitation in supply chains. HTRI is funding a study that is evaluating the impact of a project to provide working capital loans for micro contractors to reduce labor trafficking in India's construction sector. There are also lots of promising interventions happening now surrounding supply chain traceability tools, but no impact evaluations yet. So this is a list of the human trafficking RCTs and quasi-experimental impact evaluations that I referenced throughout. Again, we'll post these slides, and you can also find these in our research and learning agenda. So with that, thank you so much, and please feel free to reach out. Our email's listed here if you have questions about the HTRI Competitive Fund, or if you have any input on our research and learning agenda, if you know of any rigorous evaluations of counter-trafficking interventions that we should add, feel free to let us know. And next we'll have the second session of the day, which will discuss incidents and determinants of child and forced labor, and then also the impact of alleviation policies in Côte d'Ivoire, Brazil, and France. So we'll use the same Zoom link, and we'll see you in a minute.